The United Nations says in just a couple of months, maybe sooner, there could well be a famine in Yemen. 14 million Yemenis at risk of starvation, largely because of a terrible war between factions backed by Saudi Arabia and Iran. If help comes, is it too late? You know, in these dubious times, it takes an awful lot to get to number one, but the war in Yemen is currently the world's worst humanitarian crisis, and it is a man-made disaster fueled by battles, bombs, and blockades. You're watching Roundtable. I'm David Foster.
The UN says famine in Yemen would be the world's worst in 100 years. 75% of Yemen's population, that's 22 million people, are in need of humanitarian aid. According to the World Food Programme, in 2017, 130 children under 5 were dying from extreme hunger and disease every day. 2 million people are displaced, 76% of them are women and children. Tens of thousands of civilians have been killed and hundreds injured by the conflict. Can the Arab world's poorest country recover? Or has the international community waited too long?
Okay, what we're actually going to do, because it is such a vast subject, is to divide this into two parts. In the first program, in the first roundtable on Yemen, we will be talking about the humanitarian disaster that is unfolding there. In the second part of this roundtable special, we will be looking at the reasons why this started, why it's gone on for so long, and what efforts are being made at the moment to try and resolve it. Now, I'm very pleased to say that joining us for this first part, the humanitarian side, from Sanaa in Yemen, we have Mohamed Abdi, Country Director for the Norwegian Refugee Council. With me at the round table, Matt Saltmarsh, who speaks on behalf of the UN Refugee Agency, as well as Charles Garraway, who co-authored the UN's Group of Experts report on Yemen, and Bhanu Bhatnagar, the International Media Manager for Save the Children UK. Thank you all very much indeed. Mohamed, can I come to you first of all, because you are in Yemen. On a day-to-day basis, what do you see of what is happening out there?
What we see in Yemen is that there's huge humanitarian crisis. Large section of population is suffering because of the conflict, and war is forcing millions of people to flee from their homes. And of course, because of this conflict, there's a serious risk of famine. As you know, the new numbers from the analysis that have been done by the humanitarian communities has indicated close to 10 million people are in phase 4 of food insecurity. This is something we see on a daily basis, and the situation is likely to get worse if the conflict was to continue. If
you go to a local hospital, the one nearest to you, what would you actually see there? What condition would people be in?
I've visited a number of hospitals in Sanaa, and what I've seen personally children who are very malnourished, and the worst thing is that there are not enough facilities or resources to cater for the needs of these children. As you might know, 50% of health facilities are non-functional at the moment, so it's something that has kind of crippled the health sector.
Matt, let me come to you, and Bhanu, I'll talk to you about the work you're doing there in just a moment. When it comes to people who've lost their homes, there are hundreds of thousands in that situation. How do they survive?
Well, as has been mentioned, it really is a perfect storm of human misery out in Yemen at the moment, and the numbers are quite staggering. Well over 2 million internally displaced, close to 300,000 refugees and asylum seekers in the country. And of course, the recent conflict in and around Hodeidah has caused a huge
This is the port city that is so vital to getting in aid supplies, etc., and medical supplies.
That's correct. And that has caused about a displacement of about 500,000 people just in that conflict alone. So the priority for humanitarian agencies like ourselves is really to try to get access to those people, to bring in support, shelter, basic things that can help them live day to day, and to get food and, of course, medical support to them. That hasn't been easy because access throughout the country has been so difficult. Now, what we saw last week was, I'm sure everyone would agree, hugely encouraging. It's the first real...
These are the peace talks?
The peace talks last week, yeah. And it's really the first time the two sides have come together in 2 years. And obviously, we all hope that access can be restored, particularly to the port, which is so key, but also then linking up with the other major centres so that the agencies and the humanitarian actors can get out to support those people who have been displaced and ultimately to help them to move back to the areas from which they came.
I'll ask you how these people are managing to live in just a moment. You know, do they live in tents? Do they live in camps? How are they managing to survive? And Charles, if I could come to you in just a second to ask you about this new optimism, whether you think anything has changed in terms of the atmosphere. But Bhanu, cholera, diphtheria, I mean, the country's rife with terrible diseases. How are you, as Save the Children, managing to deal with it?
Well, I think Matt said a really good point when he said it's a perfect storm. And it's certainly a perfect storm for Yemen's children who, frankly, didn't ask for this war. We recently conducted some research and came to the conclusion that around an estimated 85,000 children are likely to have died from malnutrition and disease since the war escalated in 2015. Now, lots of numbers are thrown around in this conflict. Matt mentioned a few staggering numbers there as well. Fact is, behind each one of these numbers, there is a terrible story of misery. We from our teams hear of families who are being forced to eat leaves because they have no food left to eat. The economy is in a complete collapse. So prices have quadrupled in some cases, in some places. People can't afford medicine. There are access issues as well, so we can't get food in. And Save the Children is on the ground, but it's saving these lives is what must be the priority.
You can't get everywhere, though, can you?
Of course not. And that's why it's imperative that the warring parties, the Houthis and the Saudi and Emirati-led coalition and the government of Yemen, which is backed by that coalition, provide the humanitarian access, which I must remind your viewers is an obligation of theirs under international humanitarian law. They must protect civilians and they must provide access to those civilians for humanitarian aid groups, which we have seen time and time again that starvation has been used as a weapon of war in this conflict. And frankly, I think it's time that the warring parties are held to account for that, for those actions.
Charles, yours was a 44-page report, and you got an awful lot of information from the people you had on the ground out there.
Indeed.
As much as you could. Was it a conclusion of yours that civilians were, the terrible phrase collateral damage often comes up in conflicts such as this, but more so in this country than in other areas of civil conflict?
Yes, there is absolutely no doubt that, in fact, the major cause of casualties in terms of deaths and injuries and disease in this conflict is caused by the restrictions on access, whether you call it a blockade. There are all kinds of legal issues around blockade, but there is.
Well, use it just as an adjective. You know, I mean, what is happening?
Indeed.
Who's blockading Hodeidah, Aden, Sanaa airport?
The fact that the food is not getting in, and that other supplies are not getting in, medicines are not getting in, is the major cause of civilian casualties in terms of death and injury. Yes, there are far too many casualties being caused by the conduct of hostilities. But it is in effect the famine and the threat of famine, the malnutrition and the injuries caused by disease that are perhaps the greatest concern here. And we certainly saw that when we visited.
85,000 children.
We're losing an entire generation of children, quite literally losing an entire generation of children. And like you said, the access issue is key. If those routes are opened up, if the port is opened up, Sanaa airport is another one. If flights are not allowed to come in, You have to remember, Yemen was the poorest country in the Middle East before this conflict even began. This war has reduced the country to its knees, and we are all concerned for even if the war were to end tomorrow, it could take decades.
How do you provide shelter for them? Because it can get very cold out there at this time of year.
That's right.
And then, of course, you have stifling temperatures in the summer.
That's right. I mean, the basic answer is in appalling conditions. People who are forced to even sleep out in the open or under very basic tents in informal settlements that have been cobbled together with tarpaulin and bricks and bits of wood. And then the luckier few who might be in community centres or who might have places to stay with people that they know in different communities. So the focus is really on, obviously, shelter, but also then trying to get some money. And one of the things that we've been doing is trying to get cash assistance to people across the country. We haven't been able to give as much, and this is a frustration. Our target was to provide something like 70 or 80 million in cash assistance this year, and we're not going to get there. But we have been able to get some money to people through the Hawala system, and that can go towards winter support, that can go towards rent support, or that can go towards daily subsistence. So that's one of the things that we've been trying to focus on.
Mohamed, I'll move on. I think we've got communication with you again. I'll move on from the earlier point, because I think you partially answered that one, and just ask you about the living conditions for people as described by Matt. If you go out to one of the refugee camps, which I'm sure you do, what is available for the people who are there? The hundreds of thousands.
As you can imagine, the people that have been forced to flee from their homes, they have left behind everything that they owned. So they require, of course, shelter, food, and clean water. And this is not, there's not enough resources to cater for their needs.
Yeah. Let's bring it back to you two, and I don't know which one of you is best qualified in this position to answer this one.
Probably Charles.
But I did mention cholera.
Yes.
Yes.
You've got 160 units around the country,
Yes,
Bhanu, with Save the Children,
Yes.
I think.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Are
More or
you
less.
in any way able to contain?
Look, cholera is one of those diseases.
It's the worst in the world, isn't it? The worst outbreak
It's the
in the world.
worst outbreak ever. Before Yemen, it was Haiti, after the earthquake a few years ago. So Yemen has surpassed that now. And the sad fact is, Haiti was a natural disaster. Yemen is an entirely man-made catastrophe. So cholera only rears its ugly head when there is a complete and utter breakdown of sanitation. So I spoke to one Yemeni mother who, this is the level of desperation. They can only drink water from a dirty well because the water systems have been so damaged. Bombs have fallen on sewage pipes, etc. She has to, they don't even have enough money to buy the gas, to boil the water, to clean the water to give to her children. And her children are screaming of thirst, and she gives them this dirty water because she has no choice.
It's easily transmitted as well.
It's easily transmitted. So we are able to contain it in the sense that it's very easy to treat. Cholera is very easy to treat as long as children and families can get to the clinics. But then there are issues with fuel costs, there are issues with transport, there are issues with access. So we're talking about, again, this perfect storm, you see. Cholera is treatable, but the fact that we're seeing so many children dying or even contracting it means that there are issues with the health system, that there are not enough medicines, and that people aren't being allowed access to those clinics.
Okay, they get to the clinic. So you want to say something, Charles?
I was just going to say, you raise a very important point here. The collapse of the Yemeni economy, and in particular the fact the rial is in free fall, is perhaps one of the critical factors here. And whilst we look at the idea of a humanitarian aid and pouring humanitarian aid in, we've got in the long term, I think, to be very careful not to make Yemen entirely dependent on aid. And therefore, in the long term, again, we have got to look at building up the economy. And that's going to be a major problem.
But do you,
can I jump in with this one? Because I want to stay on the humanitarian side and the cholera medical facilities. If, as Bhanu says, somebody amazingly manages to get to a medical facility, if it still exists, how many trained people are they going to find there? Because people have left the country in their droves. Doctors, nurses, experts in this. What are they?
Well, I can go first if you don't mind. But there are lots of aid organizations like Matt's and my own and many others who are working on the front lines. But this is sort of related to the economy as well. The thing is, doctors, nurses, teachers, etc., haven't been paid for some of them for up to 2 years. So we have a situation in Yemen where highly skilled healthcare professionals are driving buses or trying to sell scrap to put food on the table. So again, this comes back to capacity building, to making sure that the economy is functioning in the right way. People are leaving in their droves, as you say. The short-term solution, the sticking plaster, if you will, are aid groups and aid organizations, but that is not the long-term solution. We must make sure that the skilled of Yemen come back and that they are paid. And I think that's part of the peace process, discussions.
Which we will be getting onto in part two. But on a physical level, what I meant, and Charles, you looked into this in some detail, on a physical level, if somebody gets to a hospital, do they find it's pretty much, well, it's hardly worth their time because there's nobody there?
Oh no, certainly the hospitals we went to, a large part of the Yemeni health service has collapsed. We know that. But there are hospitals that are working, and in particular there are Yemeni doctors who are working unpaid, as you have said, under tremendous pressure with a lack of drugs, lack of facilities, lack of everything. We saw a dialysis unit which simply cannot operate. And people are dying because of that. And you also mentioned Sanaa Airport earlier. And there again, we have a key point with the need to open Sanaa Airport because people cannot get out of Yemen.
Shall we just explain the geographical and the political position on that one? Because Sanaa is the capital of the country, but it is controlled by the Houthi rebels. The government, the official government, which is based in the south, said last week, we think it would be a good idea to reopen Sanaa Airport, with government checks, and the people who control the airport said, no, that's not going to happen. And maybe that is something that they will have gone through in Stockholm, and we will get there. But opening the airport is a real problem, isn't it?
It is a real problem, because at the moment, only International Committee of the Red Cross, UN, and Médecins Sans Frontières flights can get in. I think they are trying to open it for World Food Programme as well. But the Yemenis in the north, the Houthis in particular, are saying, we have people who need urgent medical attention abroad because we cannot provide it, but they cannot get out, and they're dying.
Is there a split between those people who are desperately ill between the two warring factions in any way?
In terms of the needs?
Yes, yes. Are those who back the Saudi-led coalition, or those who are just happen to be in those areas, are they getting more food, more water, better attention than those who are in rebel-held areas, or is it just across the board?
Well, I think there are needs throughout the country. Obviously, certain areas have had more acute problems due to lack of access, and we heard earlier about the assessments from the WFP. On the food side, there are obviously areas that are in more acute need than others because of the ability to come, and in the south, there has been more ability to bring things in. But as was mentioned earlier, Hodeidah is the primary port. It brings in, I believe, 75% of imports. It's a very import-dependent country. So that has obviously affected access in that area and parts of the north as well, and the lack of the airport, as was mentioned. I mean, another point is it is also an agrarian country, high reliance on working the land, on farming, but also on fishing. And a lot of those industries have been severely damaged and hampered by the conflict, either by the inability to access the fields and the boats and the ports, or the dangers of mines and of shelling and of air attack. So that's another area to focus on, I think, if this peace process can bed down, allowing people to get back and to work independently. And
let's talk about no-go areas if we can. Mohamed, let me come to you on this one, because look, I'll do a very quick geography lesson here, and it won't be very good. You've got Sanaa, which is sort of the highest of the major cities. Then you come down to the port city of Hodeidah. Then you go down even further south, you get to the port city of Aden, whichever you want to call it. And then if you go to the east, you get to Taiz. Now, Taiz is one place that it's almost impossible for people to get to. So are there parts of the country that you actually do not know anything about when it comes to the suffering? Mohamed?
Yes. I mean, even though we can we have access to many parts of the country, but there are areas that we cannot access simply because we are not allowed by the parties to the conflict. Like, for instance, in the north, if you have to travel from Sanaa to Hodeidah, you need to get travel permits from the authorities here, and in many instances, those travel permits are not granted.
What you're saying is it's more difficult in some parts of the country than in others. certain times you get into Thais
Can I just make a point about access?
Yeah.
Well, this is what I was going to ask, and because you're a former journalist, you're doing my work for me.
Well, because Mohamed makes a really good point. The whole thing about Hodeidah and Aden specifically, a lot of people say, well, why don't you just bring your aid in through Aden, which we do already. But the problem is, it can take up to 3 weeks for us to transport some of our life-saving medicines. And remember, there are cold storage issues and things like that, but life-saving medicines and food from Aden to where it needs to get some of the most vulnerable communities in the north. If we were able to use Hodeidah, it would take less than a week. And so therein lies some of the problems that I think we're
and
facing.
Security is obviously, because there's a war going on, is a major problem. But an area like Thais, where you go over towards the eastern oil fields, etc., was the area where AQAP, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, had a hold, and therefore it's rather difficult for people to get in there anyway and assess what's going on. Even if you get the food in, getting it to the right people safely is a problem.
AQAP are operative even further in the east than Thais. Thais is really slap on the border between Houthi-controlled areas and the government-controlled areas. And that is partly why it is so inaccessible, because it is the front line. And the point you make about access is critical, because even if you do get stuff coming in through the south, in order to get it into the north, you've got to get it across battle lines. And these are active battle lines. And similarly, if you have people who need medical attention in the north, and the majority, or at least a sizable part of the Yemeni population lives in the Houthi-controlled areas, if they need to get out, they can get out through the south, but they have to cross those battle lines to get to airports or ports in the south. That is dangerous, takes time,
and costs money.
Costs money.
Yeah.
Matt,
and there's no money.
What about rebuilding? If one gets past this particular stage, if the peace process bears any sort of fruit, these people don't have homes. They've been destroyed, by and large.
No, there would be a huge rebuilding effort. But first of all, obviously, we have to see how this process runs. There has to be sustained peace. And then at that point, you can start to plan for the rebuilding process. What I think is positive is that just recently, the United Nations has put out a huge appeal for the country, $4 billion. Now, that's actually more than has been appealed for inside of Syria, which is a very significant sum. And it shows that the United Nations is very focused on this problem and is willing and ready to move in when a lot of these issues that we've been talking about have been resolved.
So you think there's recognition now that the humanitarian situation in Yemen, and a lot of us have known about this for a long time, but more widely, that it is, if not as, well, it could be worse than what is happening in the Syrian civil war?
I think there's recognition from the United Nations and the international community that we have a huge humanitarian issue there in Yemen. Unfortunately, perhaps on the media side, things haven't followed as much and the story has been somewhat forgotten. Last week was positive in the sense that it brought it back up the agenda and more people are talking about it as we are today. But I think the United Nations and the international NGOs and actors are aware of the huge needs and have been banging the drum on this for a while.
Okay. Charles, I know you're staying with us for the second part of this, but I know you'll be leaving us, but I just want to give you an opportunity to say about the work of your organisation, Save the Children. Did you still have some hope?
Absolutely. I mean, if we didn't have hope, what's the point, frankly? Look, tens of thousands of children, it's already too late for them. And that's sad. But we are helping children every day, and we're helping them. Other agencies are helping them. Save the Children runs vital malnutrition clinics, cholera treatment centers, provides safe spaces for children to, well, just be children and play, and education programs. The point is, if those kinds of activities didn't exist, I think many more children would potentially die. But ultimately, again, I've said this before, it's not a long-term solution. A ceasefire has to stick. It has to start now with Hodeidah, which we believe should come into effect on Tuesday, tomorrow. And then we need a long-term sustainable peace.
And of course, one of the most difficult things is, yes, you can heal the physical wounds, you can stick a rehydration drip into somebody's arm if you have the possibility of doing so. You can give them clean water, but it's the scars of war that you cannot see that are actually going to be the most difficult.
Absolutely, and we actually do some programming in this space in mental health, basically. We believe, and we've done studies on this in both Iraq and Syria, both conflict-ridden countries, and found that children get extremely traumatized by the things that they witness and see, and can take years of rehabilitation to come to a place where they are children again, and they can go back to school and make friends and have relationships, normal relationships. And so that's a big part of the rehabilitation in Yemen as well.
Okay, listen, thank you all very much indeed. At least some kind of spotlight is being shone on the situation there. Mohamed Abdi, apologies for the link, but I think we can understand why getting information out of Sanaa isn't always as easy as it might be from other places. Good luck to you and the Norwegian Refugee Council in what is it's a desperate time of year for so many people, but we appreciate your time on the programme. Charles, I know you'll stay with us. Bhanu, Matt, thank you very much indeed. We will be back with the second part of this special programme on the crisis in Yemen, looking at efforts to solve the war that's going on there between the different warring factions at those talks in Sweden, and also looking at how we got to this particular point, whether it could have been avoided much more easily than it has been. From me, David Foster, from my guests, thank you very much for watching. See you soon.